you. Morning, everybody. Borda. My name is Oriel Miller. I'm the director of the IWA, and I'm chairing today's session for the Understanding Welsh Places Festival. For those of you who don't know the IWA, we're Wales's leading independent think tank with a long track record of shaping debates and influencing change in Wales through policy research and advocacy. Our online and print publications, which provide platforms for robust comment and debate, and our agenda-setting events. We're a membership organisation with members across the country and far further afield. We're funded by our members, the events we run ourselves, and independent trusts and foundations. This Understanding Welsh Places Festival is a series of online events supporting and inspiring local communities, decision makers, planners, and policymakers to make positive changes to the places where they live and work. Today, we're going to be discussing the importance of understanding the data of our places. And it's really great to see such a brilliant mixture of people in the audience today from town and community councils, third sector organisations, social care, small businesses, planners, and the Welsh Government. Through the fog of the pandemic, the importance of projects like UWP, Understanding Welsh Places, has become even clearer. COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of where we live, who lives in our communities, where we get our food, and where we access the local services that exist. For better or worse, the pandemic has meant most of us are getting to know our immediate surroundings far better than we may have before. We may be noticing for the first time how much we have on our doorstep, or noticing what our places are missing. At the IWA, we believe in empowering communities by giving them the tools they need to make change, and that's what we're here to do today. We'd really like to thank our funders, the Carnegie UK Trust, for making these events possible. Before we carry on, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm sure many of you will have done plenty of Zoom webinars already. So if you're an attendee, you're anonymous unless you interact either in the chat or in the Q&A. So do please use that to say hello. We're going to use the Q&A section for questions. And if you'd like to direct your question to a particular panelist, please do state their name. We really encourage you to engage in the chat because we know that networking opportunities are few and far between, and I'm really missing those spontaneous moments where you can discover something from an ad hoc conversation in the corridor. Please do remember, though, that all chat and questions are recorded. We are going to kick off first with a session from our data expert, Professor Scott Alford, who's going to act as your guide through the Understanding Welsh Places website. He's going to explain the data, how the website can work for you, and provide a detailed update on the new data which is coming to the site this year. Okay, so first of all, I also wanted to say we're very sorry that we don't have Blaenavon Town Council with us today. Unfortunately, our participants were poorly at the last minute, so can't join us. So I wanted to give you a heads up about that, but we will have more time for Q&A later on. We're going to take questions for Scott's session immediately after his presentation. So Scott, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to share my presentation on the screen. So just bear with me for a second. Okay, so this is an introduction to the Understanding Welsh Places website. So some of you may have already been to the website and had a look around, others haven't. So this is going to be an overview from why we developed the website, what the website does at the moment, and what the new iteration of the website will look like towards the end of the year. So just a bit of background to the project. The project's been going on for several years now, particularly in the planning stage. So it was undertaken by the Carnegie UK Trust who identified there was a policy and advocacy gap when it comes to towns. Towns weren't necessarily a policy focus. And there was also a shortage of robust data on towns and smaller communities. And so they've identified this as a policy agenda going forward. And they undertook a series of focus groups and meetings in various parts of Wales relating to Welsh towns, and then they published recommendations which included developing a website which was town focused to allow community groups, planners, policymakers to access data, particularly around towns and places. This followed a similar project in Scotland, Understanding Scottish Places, and some of the website was inspired by the Scottish Places website. And the Understanding Welsh Places website was funded by the Cynulliu and Welsh Government and was launched a year ago, last September 2019. So the aim of the website is to be the first point of call for statistical information about towns and communities in Wales. So there's a lot of data out there about places in Wales, particularly the Stats Wales website and the Welsh Government. But these aren't necessarily aimed at towns or local communities. And the data that is available can be slightly hidden if you're not really used to navigating those sorts of portals. So what we've done is we've collated existing published data from a variety of websites, including the Stats World websites, but also other websites at the town level, and created a very useful interface to be able to access that. So the idea is to support people to use data to identify opportunities in their areas. They could use it to support funding proposals, for instance, and it's to inspire communities and placemakers and policymakers to make positive changes about the places where they live. So why is UWP different from other portals, other websites that are already out there? Well, like I said, it's based around town community level. It's based around about 300 places we've identified in Wales as being a town or a local community. And the focus is on place. So it drills below local authority, which tends to be the sort of typical geography you get data for. It also produces or presents data in a way which we think is user-friendly. So it presents it in forms of simple to understand graphs, maps, and figures. We've also produced, hopefully we find an accessible user interface that makes it easy to not just get data about a particular place, but also to compare data for places as well. We've generated extra analysis. So for all places over 2,000 residents, we've actually analysed some of the data, and we've come up with some categories of place to help you actually navigate the site and also to undertake comparisons. And there's also a place on the site that allows you to share your plans and research. So the first iteration, which was launched last year, that the data concerned the main demographic, socioeconomic type of data that a lot of you will be familiar with. So things such as population, including age distribution and ethnic groups, data on Welsh language and national identity, data on employment, occupation, education, on social conditions. There's also a lot of data on what we call community assets. So numbers of shops, numbers of schools, GPs, dentists, charities. We've also included data on commuter journeys, which was from the census, and there's also some rural indicators as well. So there's a wide variety of data that's available. Some of this data is available for some towns, but not for others, depending on how big the town is. And I'll go into this in a bit more detail. We also undertook some analysis. So we're not just presenting data that's published elsewhere. We did undertake some statistical analysis. So we identified places which had over 2,000 people, and we selected a variety of different socioeconomic and population variables, and we used them to cluster and create a category of 7 types of settlement based upon their characteristics around their sort of socioeconomic and demographic characteristics. And there's a map of them there. So you can, what we've done by here, we've hopefully placed similar types of town together to get you thinking about what town is similar to the place where you live. And it might not be a neighbouring town. This is the important thing. Sometimes a similar town might be on the other side of Wales. So it's to get you start thinking a bit more out of the box over what a comparable town is to the place where you live. And then we also categorized each town by the population size as well. And so you can use the categories as a way of trying to understand the town. And we created basic descriptions of towns based upon these categories. And by drilling down into the categories, you can find unexpected synergies between towns that you wouldn't have thought were similar, but they are based upon the data we've looked at. We've also created some analysis based upon how dependent or independent a place is to other places in Wales. It's what we call an interrelationship assessment. And we've based this on public assets and social assets, such as number of GPs per head of population, number of school places per head of population. And we've also created a classification system on based upon this data. So you can also see how your place is, how dependent or independent your place is as well. And this can also be a tool for comparison. So there's two types of categories we've done. And you can also combine the categories as well to see how different your place is, how related your place is to another place in the same category. So these are the indicators we use to create this relationship score in the first iteration of Understanding Welsh Places. So as I've said, they're all based upon this idea of community asset. Numbers of GPs and dentists, numbers of hospitals, numbers of schools, and these are all presented as per capita. And then from that, we've generated how dependent they are. So independent places have a high number of assets in relation to the population. They have a strong diversity of jobs, and residents travel shorter distances to travel to work. Sort of independent to dependent places, the place that fall between, have a median number of assets in relation to the population. They have an average diversity of jobs, and residents travel a mix of short and long distances to work. And then more dependent places have a low number of assets in relation to their population, and a reliance on one sector for their jobs, and they tend to travel long distance to work. And there's also sort of similar in terms of their sort of retail offer, and then their school offer as well. So if you were to go to the actual website, you come to the landing page here. We've tried to keep it as clean as possible. So at the top along here, you've got a list of places. So you can click on list of places, and it gives an alphabetical list of all the places that we have on the website. There's about 300 places in Wales. Or you can actually click on a map of them. So instead of a list, it's a map of places, and you can click on the pointers on the map. Or you can just click on what you want to do today. Do you want to browse the map, find information about the place? So we try to keep it quite straightforward. If you were to select a place, so in Stradminnock here, the first thing that would appear is a location map of the place in relation to other places. And you can zoom in and out of this map. It puts the place in the middle here. And you can see these points here are other places that we've got information about on the website. You could click on this and go to that information. If you were to scroll down, it gives you first of all a description of the place. So you've got a very short description of the place, and we've tried to get town councils and community groups to write their own description of the place they live in. And currently where there was a few missing when we launched in last September, and we've spent the last year filling in the gaps. So the next iteration will have all of these filled in. And then has which category in, so it's in a place category 3. The categories aren't ranked anyway. We've not ranked the categories. We just, so we can't say category 1 is better than category 2. We're just giving them categories. So this is a category 3 place, and this is a description of what a category 3 place is. So it's a medium-sized town in terms of its population, and then it gives you a general summary of what you expect a typical category 3 place to be. Now, it might not be precisely what this place is, because it's a generalized category, but it'll have some of the characteristics of it. It's also what we call an interdependent to dependent place. So it does have some community assets, but it is reliant on other places for things such as travel to work and diversity of offer. And we can have a look at to see what aspects it is dependent on, what variables it is dependent on. And you can compare with other places. So you can either look at the data just for this place, or you can compare this data with other places as well. So if you clicked on compare with different places, it comes up with a pop-up screen, and you can either search for any place on the system, any of the 300 places we've got, or it will give you a list of all those places which are in the same category. So these are category 3 places. And you can click on, I think we say click up to 3 or 4 of them. You can click on all of them, but then you'll get faced with data. So we just clicked on 3. So these 3 places are in the same category. And then what it'll do, it'll then start presenting different types of data. So the first of the data it'll give you are simple numbers and percentages of around different themes. So this particular theme is employment and distance to work. So the number at the top is the place that you've actually selected initially, is Stradminnock, and then underneath are the 3 other places we're going to compare it to. So this is the number of jobs, people working from home, etc. And it gives you sort of a breakdown of employment and distance to work for your place and your comparator places. So there's a whole series of these sort of tables of data. So I've just used employment and distance to work as an example. It then allows you to look at this independence of place in a bit more detail. So what it does, this is an interactive graph, so it's not interactive on my PowerPoint presentation, but it is interactive. So it gives you the different variables that we're measuring independence of place on. So these are employment variables here, number of jobs, diversity of jobs, distance travel to work. And then there's, and then this side is whether a place is dependent on other places. This side of the graph is whether it's more independent. And then it gives you the different places here. Now, if you were to click on this, it will actually tell you that this is Blackwood, this is Caerphilly, this is whatever the ones you've chosen, and it will actually expand it as well. It doesn't work very well on the PowerPoint presentation, but this is interactive. So it'll give you an idea of how your place compares to other places in terms of how independent or not it is along these different variables. There's a whole series of variables as you scroll down. And the red is the Welsh average. So you compare to the Welsh average. So that's independence of place. And you can play around with this. The whole point of the website is to interact with it and spend a bit of time using it. What you then have is a series of graphs which then summarize your key socio-demographic variables. So we've chosen 4 places, so you'll get 4 graphs. So this is the age distribution. The red bar, the red here is the Welsh average, and the blue is the actual place. Unsurprisingly, you'll find that they're very similar because they're in the same category. So these variables we use to put them into categories, but it can tell you across which socioeconomic dimension they might vary. And it's really useful if you choose places from different categories, because then you can see how places vary across these different variables. There's a whole series of these radial graphs that you can use. We've also included a commuter map as well. So this shows you people commuting in and out of Stradminnock based upon the 2001 census. And so each line is at least 20 commuters. So anything below 20, we're not showing. And the thickness of the line is the number of commuters. And you can click on the line and it brings up the details. So I clicked on this one for Swansea and it shows you how many people are commuting into Swansea and out of Swansea to the different place. So you've got a whole series of commuter maps if you want. And finally, because we realised that actually you might want to understand how your place fits in with data on a more regional scale or national scale, and not all places. So if your place has less than 2,000 residents, you haven't got this data, these radial plots or these independence of places. We've allowed a series of thematic maps. You'd like to produce thematic maps across a series of different socioeconomic variables. So there's about 40 or 50 variables actually, or 40 or 50 different maps you can produce. And again, you can zoom in and out. So this is for whole of Wales, and they're at the lower super output area geographies. So they're also useful for larger towns and cities. So Cardiff is a single place in this in our system. So if you want to know what's happening within Cardiff, then these sort of maps are quite useful to do. Like I've said, the website was launched last year, and we've spent this year looking how we can update it. So we're updating it a number of ways. So we're filling the gaps in those place descriptions. There was about 100 places which we didn't have descriptions for, so we spent this year trying to get them and put them in. We've also looked at new types of data. So data which is useful but was slightly harder to come by in the first session, the first iteration. So we've included things like access to green space. We're looking at trying to get data on cultural assets. Among the people that go to the theatre and cinema and things like that from the Arts Council for Wales. We've got data on internal migration. We've got a variety of data from the new version of the Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, which was launched after we launched this last year. So we had to wait for them to launch. So we've got data for places on there, particularly access to services. We've got information on GP mental health, more information on social enterprises, and we've also got some very useful data for mobile phones on travel between places during weekdays and weekends. So the commuting data is from the census, but that's just commuting to work. So we've managed to fill in some of the gaps by using mobile phone data from a company called City Logic. So that tells you how many people are moving between places outside of commuting times and also the weekends as well. So there'll be more of those sort of flow maps that we're going to be producing. So that was an overview. So I'm happy to take questions on the website. Thank you.
Unmute myself. Thanks very much indeed, Scott, for that. We've got about 10-15 minutes for questions. I think it might be worth just saying a little bit about the members of the consortium who, if you could stop your screen sharing, Scott, that would be
I'm trying to.
Right now. Okay, thank you. Who the members of the consortium were. We started with a fantastic group, and it's great to see many of them in the audience today. From town and community councils, Federation of Small Businesses, WCVA, a former chief exec of a county council, somebody involved in regeneration in a local authority currently, somebody involved from a point of view of working with communities right across the country, particularly those most deprived, and the Carnegie Trust as well. So we very much built it with the involvement of people doing things in real places and testing things out in a very iterative way in 6 or 7 different communities across the country before we launched it last year. And underneath that, and something that Scott has been part of once Wizard won the contract for developing the website, is a data group that has included colleagues from the ONS, from Welsh Government and others. And I know one of the questions to Scott from Ken Barker is around sources of data, because obviously the census was quite a long time ago now. So could you just talk us through, please, that? I mean, from a data layperson's perspective, right. And I'm fairly geeky when it comes to data, you wouldn't be surprised to hear, perhaps. One of the thresholds that we've had to make sure of is that we've got data for every place across Wales that is included. So we can't have data for some places and not for others. So we've had a fairly high threshold in terms of the rigor of the data that we've included. And we've also had the Welsh Government's chief statistician both on the consortium group and on the data group itself, contributing to that. Scott, can you talk us through the sources of data when we've included admin data that's more recent, but is still consistent and applicable right across the country, and how we're engaging with the process for the 2021 census, please?
Yeah, okay, so yes, I mean, we're looking at fairly small places here. Therefore, the data is limited. It's not as if we're looking at local authority data where you've got a lot more data. So a lot of the basic data does derive from the 2011 census of population. Although we have tried to diversify away from that where possible. I'm on a variety of data groups of the Welsh Government. I'm on the WIMD data group. I'm also on a census data group. So I'm sort of familiar with development. So I'm familiar with the more up-to-date data that's available. So for the community asset data, we used the data the Welsh Government provide for GPs and dentists. We use the data they provide for school places. We're working with a company called CLES, which is the Centre
for Local Economic Strategies.
Yeah, okay.
And they're doing a workshop for us on day 3 actually as well.
Yeah, they provided us with quite a bit of data as well, because they've got access to survey data at a very sort of fine geographical scale. So they were able to aggregate the data up to the units we wanted. We couldn't get access to that data because they access it for a secure data agreement with the ONS. So things like diversity of jobs and retail and those sort of data came from that sort of survey data, which was weighted. So CLES did a lot of work with us from that to make sure we got up-to-date data on that sort of commercial side of it. They also did the independence of place work for us as well, and they come up with the scores using their methodology. So all this is on the website. So the website, there's a page upon where we've got all our data sources in detail, and also the methodology as well. So the data is very, very transparent. For WP2, as I said, we've accessed some of the travel to work, so the travel to services data from the WIMD, but at the local sort of town level. So it's slightly different from what's published on their WIMD site, which is for low super upper area level.
WIMD being Welsh Index of Multiple Deprivation, just doing a little bit of jargon busting in here. Yes,
Welsh Index, which the new version came out in November last year, 2 months after we launched ours. So which is why there's been a delay for us to access that data. But that's got things like travel time to school, primary schools and secondary schools, in terms of public and private transport. So it's actually very useful data, and we managed to aggregate it up to the town level. So we'll be recalculating our independence of place scores based upon that data as well, to get a slightly more nuanced understanding of how places are dependent or non-dependent. Okay. In terms of the census, one thing we want to do eventually when this data gets released would be to refresh the entire site and recalculate the cluster classifications for the places, because no doubt they will change. And then we can put change over time statistics on as well, because one thing that's missing, that's on the Scottish website, is they do have, because they've been going for longer, they've got how places have changed over the last few years. And that's something we want to do, but it's just too soon at the moment. But once the census comes out, probably another couple of years or so, by the time it comes out for the level we want, we'll be able to then put a whole series of statistics of how places have changed over the last 10 years.
Thank you, Scott. That's really helpful. I think it's worth saying, obviously, that the Scottish version, as you say, has been going longer. There is no English version yet, and there's lots of sort of jumping up and down of people wanting that. One of the things we are working with a couple of local authorities, in particular Monmouthshire and Paris in the first instance, is what kind of cross-border linkages could we explore? What sort of data would be useful across borders, particularly as we've seen during the last 8 months, the issues around regulations and travel and accessing services in a different country and what that means. So we're starting to test that out at the moment. There's a question about the commuter maps. There are different colours as well as different sizes of lines, Scott. Could you just explain what that means?
I'm racking my brains to remember what the different colours were. I think it was just make it easier to read.
Okay.
If they're all the same colour, just like a big splodge.
Yeah, so Ellen, if we could just check up on that, please.
But just check on that, yeah. I know the thickness is the number of people commuting. I think the colours are just legibility. I think we tried in one colour, and it just looks like a splodge if it's you know, as it goes in. So yeah.
And one of the things obviously that we really wanted to make sure is that it isn't aimed at data geeks. It is aimed at anybody, so that you should be able to access it very very easily. There's a question from Emily Cottrell. Hi Emily. Is the Welsh average at the midpoint of all the independent sliding scales as it was on the image that you showed, or does the system recognise that on average Wales perhaps skews one way or the other?
It isn't always in the middle, actually. The ones I showed, they did sort of fall in the middle, but they do vary depending on the particular variable you're looking at, particularly if the variable does vary. So diversity of jobs and diversity of retail, that doesn't fall in the middle. That does fall to one side or the other. So it's not always in the middle, no.
Great, okay, thank you. And a question from Jess Williams, which is around the updating of the data and how often it happens, and are there any plans to link to health inequalities? So from what you and I have discussed, Scott, you know, these are live links, aren't they, through to existing databases. So can you talk about the process? I mean, there's UWP2, which is coming online later this year, but what about the plans around health and health inequalities?
Yeah, well, we've been looking at trying to link it to the well, because of the COVID-19, we've been thinking about how you could actually use it to help to plan for COVID-19. So health and health inequalities is one of the things that has suddenly become very, very important. So we are looking at the sort of data. What limits us is the fact that we're looking at the level of towns rather than local authorities or health boards. And that does sort of limit the sort of data we can get, unless we're willing to map or present at a much higher scale, which we might have to do for health inequalities. We might have to sort of think about it. But we're definitely looking, because of COVID-19, there of mapping that, because you can get that MS middle super output area. So it's slightly larger than we're looking at, but smaller than local authorities. And because of the Future Generation Act as well, we've been trying to look at how the whole website could map onto the different indicators. And again, we've been discussing with the Welsh Government, there is an issue with a lot of the indicators for the Future Generations Act being national or local authority level and not local. So there is this, and this has been acknowledged by the Welsh Government, there's a problem drilling down into smaller scale geographical areas of how you can sort of monitor and plan for that.
Okay. Thank you. Next question from Hugh Thomas, who's really interested in how they incorporate this into the understanding of how we consume health resources and how we use the data to test the appropriateness of our allocation of resources going forward. Is there anything you want to comment on that?
Oh, so this is Hugh.
I think, have you got a meeting lined up soon, Scott, to discuss it?
I'm not sure, actually. I can't remember.
Or Ellen does.
It'd be useful to have these conversations, actually, how people are actually going to use the data in a variety of different ways. So the first aim was to get community groups to use the data. But because the website's been so useful and it's been well designed, that actually policymakers and practitioners are also using it. So maybe
we could pick this up in what would have been the slot for Blaenavon after Delyth's conversation, and we could hear a bit
that'd be really helpful.
People. Yeah. David Farnsworth, hello David. We've got a question from David about how does understanding the profile of a particular place help to plan out options for future change or development of that place? And just before I pass over to you, Scott, I think there's one of the things that we felt was really important was the description of the place was written by the Town and Community Council themselves as much as possible, not by somebody sitting in an office in Cardiff Bay. So that we had a conversation with Town and Community Councils, I think probably a good year and a half ago, at least, if not 2 years. And we asked people, what sort of indicators do you think should be included? And it was things like, heritage and main businesses and, food and theatres and landscape. What kind of indicators should be the ones? And then we came up with a long list of sort of 12 or 15, and people have chosen the ones that they think is most important. They think are most important to their own place. So it was very much the voices of that place at this point in time, and an opportunity to say we want to develop it in this sort of way in future. I'm hoping, Delyth, I mean, see you're nodding a lot, hoping you're going to pick up on some of that too. So back to you, Scott. In terms of understanding the profile of a place, maybe it's a question for the conversation a bit later on, helping us planning out options for future change or development.
Yeah, one of the reasons why we categorised the places was we wanted to avoid people just comparing their town to the town next door, because they're similar and facing the same types of problems. We wanted you to start thinking a bit differently about what a similar place looks like, based upon the variables we used. So what this does, it actually indicates that some places that's similar to you might be in North Wales if you're in South Wales, or in West Wales if you're in East Wales. It's not necessarily the ones next to you. If you look at the map, there's obviously a clustering, because that's what happens. Similar people live in similar places. But there are some quite interesting comparisons to be made. So that's one of the reasons why we did it. So if you were thinking about initiatives and interventions in your place, you could, instead of looking at what was happening next door, you could perhaps talk to a different town council in another part of the country that you wouldn't have thought of talking to, because you didn't think that your place was similar to theirs. So that was the rationale behind it. It was to sort of to give you some tools to start thinking about comparisons, or what a meaningful comparison is.
Yeah, and I think it was about enabling that network across the country. You know, not all conversations need to go up and through local authorities. They can be much more horizontal, and thinking that, you know, my place actually isn't like somebody else nearby can be a game changer for lots of people. I'm going to move on to a question from Edward Humphreys. Hi, Edward. For town and community councils, a focus also lies at the level of community rather than LSOAs. So there may be a number of LSOAs in a community. So are these aggregated to community level?
Yeah, what we've used is contiguous built-up areas as our geographical unit, which is based upon a series of LSOAs. They don't necessarily fit nicely into it, but the ONS and the Welsh Government have produced a lookup table that maps LSOAs onto these geographies. It's also an official statistical geography as well, so there are data released for these areas, including the WIMD, if you know where to look.
And that's what the red line is, isn't it, on the map,
yeah.
The contiguous built-up area. So you can see that when you look at the map of your place when you go into the system.
Yeah. And on the website, we've put a brief description and then a link to the Office of National Statistics website, which describes the methodology in more detail. So that's what we used. It's not a traditional census geography. It's one that tries to capture this idea of a town and its environs. But you can link census geography to it, which of course is an important consideration.
Great. We've got a question from Hal Jones. Hello, Hal, who noticed that we mentioned details around Welsh language and national identity, and was wondering what criteria around Welsh language was used. Was this reference to national identity, and was it available by ethnicity?
It's basically what was asked in the 2011 census. We did look into other data sets, but they didn't conform to what our criteria was about being national and being available at these sort of local geographies that we're using. It would be useful to, if there are other data sets out there that we don't really know about, and we do listen, and if you know a data set about national identity, which is national, and we can drill down to small places, then please tell us. We can sort of start developing that aspect on the website a bit more. But currently, it is just what was asked in the census in 2011. Okay,
brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Scott, I'm going to ask you to take your video off now so we can just focus on Delyth. Thank you, Scott. Brilliant. Brilliantly to time as well. For those of you who are coming to day 3, that won't be a webinar, it'll be a meeting. So there'll be much more opportunity to interact between each other and in breakout groups and things. So if you want to have some of these nitty-gritty conversations about how do you use it and so forth, that's the slot to come to on day 3, which is Thursday this week. We're now going to move on to Llanelli Town Council, and we're going to hear a case study and inspiration for what they've done to enact positive change in their community. Like I said at the beginning, there were meant to be 2 case studies on the agenda today, but unfortunately Blaenavon are unable to join us due to ill health, and we wish them a speedy recovery. It just so happens I have family links with both Llanelli and Blaenavon, so I'm particularly interested to hear what you're going to say, Delyth. Delyth Jones is Community Development Officer for Llanelli Town Council. You're very welcome. She joined the Town Council in 2014 after 12 years with Communities First and Economic Development in Carmarthenshire County Council. And more recently, she supported the development of the Llanelli Community Partnership, the Llanelli We Want, and Llanelli Community Emergency Plan, amongst others. So we know, Delyth, that in Carmarthenshire, a number of town and community councils have been working in a really unique way in your communities. Could you tell us, please, about what you've been doing?
Yeah, thank you. Llanelli Town Council, sort of, we're a fairly large sort of like town council, just a preset of just under £1 million, population of about 26,000 people. And we're certainly probably one of the largest with a rural council in Llanelli, sort of like in Carmarthenshire. I think it's probably fair to say, and if I start sort of this presentation really with talking about what we've done in relation to the Future Generations Act and how we as town and community councils work together in Carmarthenshire. And then what I will do is talk a little bit about our involvement in the Welsh Places as a separate part, and then also as well how we've been able to utilise some of the data that Scott's been able to put together in a more practical way with the community. So we've got 7 town community councils in Carmarthenshire that make up, that are beholden then, isn't it, to the Future Generations Act. So we were very lucky, or I was very lucky in economic development when I worked with Communities First. I got involved very, very early on with Peter Davis when we were in the development of putting together the Future Generations Act for Wales. So when I came across the town council, I had that sort of information. The writing was on the wall of where the changes were going to be with regards to town and community councils, and that, the larger town and community councils were going to be held accountable, for what we do and strategically link us in more. So I came across 2014 and very early on started with the town council, really working with Peter, and we became one of the top 100 early adopters for the Future Generations Act in Wales. So that led to us really sort of like looking internally at how we're structured, what we do. Did we have the proper forward planning programs in place, etc. And I think it's fair to say we probably didn't. My role alone, we've always had a community development officer here in the town council. We've had an officer for 16 years, but they took the decision on me coming on board, isn't it? And after I arrived, within 6 months, we changed the role really of my job in order to become more sort of a community facing. It was less about project work, it was more about listening to the community and what the community felt they needed, and then internally changing then, isn't it, what we did as a town and community council. So we very much used the Future Generations Act really as a vehicle for change. And we looked at all of our internal structures, how we what our reporting mechanisms were, down to where I report within the town council. How could we get, isn't it, the community to be telling us more about what they needed in their own communities, and how could we build that into our our actual working programs, our development, and working with the members also as well. So we created very early on sort of like a member involvement group, and there are 11 members that are involved in that. They're called our FG group. Myself and the deputy clerk and the clerk, town clerk, work quite closely with that group. We put all of our, our working programs through that group. And really, it's my role to listen to what the community feel they need and want, and look at the data to ensure, isn't it, we're all singing off the same hymn sheet. And then how does what the community want, isn't it, come into what we deliver as a town and community council? How does that influence what we do? We're responsible, isn't it? We have to, we're working very closely with the Public Service Board in Carmarthenshire, and therefore it has to really come from the community straight up to the Public Service Board, and then, isn't it, beyond then, isn't it, with the Public Service Board. So really, how did we ensure that route, and also any information that was coming from the Public Service Board, actually came down and tallied with the community groups also as well. I'm happy to say in Llanelli, I don't work with everybody. I can't. We, 25,000 people, I'm one person. But I think what FG has done is to enable that we work where we should be working. So we try to work in areas that of need. We try to be very responsive. With the COVID, obviously, we've had to be incredibly responsive with COVID very quickly, and we were able to do that back in March, which was really good. We're quite a small team, there's only 5 of us here, so we were able to almost stop the train quite quickly, look to see what was needed, with the food banks, with the community groups. We were able to act really very quickly, and I think that's been a really good lesson for us, that we can actually really adapt to change quite quickly. What we then started doing very early on in probably 2015, 16, we started to identify who the other town and community councils were within Carmarthenshire, actually, that we're going to need to work in a similar way to ourselves. And about a year out before it was launched, we started having conversations, isn't it, with the Rural Council. And this was the leader and the clerk initially. I at the time was the only community development officer with town and community councils. That has now changed. We now have 7 community development officers. And initially, the conversations were really around us. So, the Rural Council, what were the Rural Council doing? There were areas of commonality. How could we share, for instance, a ground maintenance team, for instance, to cut down on our resources? So there was no need to have 2 ground maintenance teams. If you understand the Rural Council and the Town Council, we cover the 5 wards in Llanelli, and then the Rural Council literally surrounds us. Between us, we cover about 45,000 people, and we've got the largest issues as far as deprivation is concerned, as you can well imagine. And also we're seen as I guess Carmarthenshire is often seen as the gateway, isn't it, to the west. So, we're fairly unique in Carmarthenshire. We have an incredibly close working relationship with the Rural Council. So there were sort of opportunities to share resources and to work together. What we then started to do, we identified 7 of us that were going to meet the criteria, isn't it? And what we started doing then was working together. At this stage, we were not working with the Public Service Board or Carmarthenshire County Council. We were working together, the clerks and the leaders were meeting. And what you've got amongst the 7 as well, which is quite interesting, is some of us are quite large. Ourselves and the Rural Council, a preset of just over £1 million. And then you've got smaller areas and locations that maybe only have 4,000 people in them. So, I mean, how is it, an area like Carmarthenshire can then work, like Llanelli, sorry, Town Council can work then, isn't it? With Carmarthen Town and Community Council, that's a smaller area up in the Ammon area, which is 17 miles away from us, has very different issues and needs within the community. So how could we work with them? Where was the areas of commonality? And what we started to do quite quickly was to form this working group. We then started working with the Public Service Board in Carmarthenshire County Council. We got involved very early on with that, but we did not have a seat at the Public Service Board until recently. So it's taken us about 2 to 3 years to actually get, a voice, if you can understand, actually at Public Service Board meetings. But actually that was okay for us because we didn't need to be at the public service in the actual Public Service Board meetings. We had a very good and still continue to have a very good relationship with the Public Service Board officers. They attend our development officers meetings, and what we've now developed is a framework that we can work through as the 7 of us. And the 7 of us actually cover probably around about 60 to 70% of the population of Carmarthenshire. So actually, and a preset, probably somewhere around 5 million if not more. So actually, we should be working together really more, and we should be focusing on areas of commonality. And so what we've now, where we are today, and it's taken us sort of 2.5 years really to get to this stage, where we are now today is that each of the town and community councils has a development officer. That development officer's job description was very much varied off mine. So we all have a very similar way of working. We have town and community council meetings, isn't it? Obviously, that happen with the Public Service Board. We have a working group, which the Public Service Board and Carmarthenshire County Council region officers attend. And as development officers now, we also have a seat at that table with the clerks as well. And what we don't so much have the leaders, but if the leaders like to attend, there's obviously always that opportunity for them to do so. But generally what we have is the clerk and development officers. And we meet on normally a quarterly basis. COVID's kind of thrown that a little bit, but we have still managed to operate through COVID, albeit online. And then we have a development officers meeting afterwards. We have a development officer structure also as well. So the 7 of us work together. We don't have one of us that organises the others. We generally tend to host it amongst each other, and we'll meet every quarter also as well, neither leading up to the Public Service Board meetings or after. And we will work on areas of commonality. So an area of commonality for us going into Christmas, for instance, will be Carmarthenshire County Council's Toy Box Appeal. So how is it, as the 7 town and community councils, how can we support the Toy Box Appeal? Now, if you look at the 7 areas, obviously we have more in common. I would have more in common with Jenny Fox in Carmarthen Town Council. If you can imagine, we're a very similar, we're both towns, etc. So Jenny and I will have, even though Jenny's 20 odd miles away, we'll have areas of commonality that we will work on. One of those, for instance, as I'm talking here, would be something like the 10 of us community choir, for instance. There's a 10 of us community choir here in Llanelli, which I'm part of, but also in Carmarthen as well. So Jenny will support the 10 of us community choir from Carmarthen's sake, and I will support it from Llanelli. So, there are small sort of, project work then, isn't it, that works quite well. So in Carmarthenshire, that's the way in which we're working. We've recently, we're in the 2nd year of producing our annual reports to the Public Service Board. What we did year 1 actually was to work with the Public Service Board and have one reporting mechanism. So we all agreed a template, and it was the development officers actually that agreed that template for the Public Service Board. So the Public Service Board weren't receiving 7 different reports, because God help, it's enough to go through, and what we did this year was to use that template, and what we have all had an opportunity to do this year actually is to meet the Public Service Board, talk through what our annual report was with the Public Service Board, where we felt things were going really well, where we felt things were going really difficult. What we've been able to do with the members as well is really educate the members also in this way of working also as well, and not only the members but the community groups as well. So we set up the Llanelli Community Partnership, which is a network of organisations and people, and that network has worked really, really well over the last few years. They're in year 4 now, and we support them. And they have their own, independency as a community organisation, but they now follow the Future Generations Act also as well, and they have been following that for 3 years. So they use the Future Generations Act as a vehicle also as well. It puts us all in the same ballpark. We as organisations, majority of us in Llanelli are following, and working closely, isn't it, with FG, and it's providing all of those opportunities for us, isn't it? And we're now seen as a key. I think it's probably fair to say we're seen as a key player in Llanelli. We're seen as a go-to sort of authority that can help on the ground, and we're probably the closest actually when it comes to democracy within the community. Carmarthenshire County Council's up here, so it's slightly below, so we're the closest to the community, and with the members also as well. So if I can just talk a little bit about what we've done with regards to Welsh Places. We were involved in Welsh Places fairly early on. We wrote our description for Llanelli Town Council, myself, the clerk and the deputy clerk and some of the members. And also as well, we've been able to use the data And what I've been able to do with the data is really to look at producing sort of like almost like a story behind the baseline for Llanelli. An example of what's happened with that data then is we were able to recently work with the lottery, for instance, and provide that data with one of their development officers that supports our location and area. And we were able to say to them, look, this is the story behind the baseline for Llanelli. So when they had community organisations coming in for funding, they could see, isn't it, if whether that project was, was actually addressing the need with regards to the data. All has to be taken into caveat. This isn't the only data that we use. We try to keep an eye on, isn't it, all of the other sort of data information that is out there. We're not hung up on data, but for us, it's really good to know that we are in this, our knowledge, isn't it, is actually matched by what the data is telling us. And that's always good for us. It's a good check back to ensure that actually what we think and we think we know is actually what's happening. And that's reflected in the data is important for us when we're talking about, if we're talking about spending public monies, we need to be, we need to be getting it right. And it's not just somebody, sticking a finger in the air and going, well, I think, we can actually, say, well, actually the data is showing us that actually we're in the right ballpark, So with regards to then our annual reports and whatnot and our strategic planning, it really helps. We have a very simple process within the town council. We have a document which is done on Excel. There's nothing fancy about it, believe me. It's reviewed every 6 months. It's a flexible document. More recently, we've been reviewing it every 3 months because of what's been going on with COVID. We can add to it, we can change, but that forms the basis of our annual return. And all of the other community councils, all 7 of us are working in an incredibly similar way. We have the flexibility within the group, isn't it, for each of them to work in the way in which they need to within their communities. But then we also have, isn't it, that opportunity to work together. So it's a lot. It's 7 of us working together actually in Carmarthenshire is unique, I think, to Wales, and have all of us having development officers is also unique, I think, to Wales. I think having the data sort of like back up what we're able to do, we're able to share, has been useful, I think, also as well. So, it's taken us a long time, though, to get to this stage.
Delyth, that's a really fantastic story of how you started, a few years ago and where you've got to now. So some of the reflections that I'm taking from that discussion are clarity of the roles, knowing what you wanted to try and achieve, really good distributed leadership as well. No one person in charge, everybody taking their turn as well, but working that through together. Lines of communication in terms of where the information goes, who uses it, and where it comes back again. So that's very iterative, checking in on, is this right? And one of the other things I thought was really clever was, yes, based on the evidence and the data, but also what does that mean for your place? It's data without an understanding of what that significance isn't enough, is it? It's what's the story? What are we trying to achieve? How are we trying to achieve it? So I think you've given us a really good tour of that. I wanted to ask a couple of questions around. And I thought it was a really sensible approach. I like the kind of, it's a really great, sensible approach to take. And that sounds as though you've worked really steadily and incrementally. A couple of questions first. One is, what sort of bumps on the road have you had to that in terms of, problems you've either had to get by or get over or work a way around, because this isn't how we do things, which can often be quite a blocker. And then the other one is, you've got really strong relationships within Carmarthenshire. Have you had any engagement with other places across Wales in terms of, oh, well, actually, the data is telling us that there's this here in Carmarthen or in Llanelli or wherever, but actually, let's look at what goes on here and how easy have you found it to make those connections independently?
Okay, bumps in the road are change. Town and community councils, very much so when I joined, was no, this is the way in which we do things. It's a long process in order to be able for us to change anything. We have, structured committee meetings, everything has to go through, the committees, etc. So, just putting it through that structure, the change management has taken us a number of years. This is not something we did overnight. And that's been difficult for all of us, isn't it? But we have been able to show that this kind of level of working does work. And so there is more now. We're in a position, isn't it, where there's more of a willingness to work together and more of a willingness for things to change, and we've had to. So bumps in the road on that, and the other bump on the road really was with trying to establish, isn't it, with the Public Service Board. We were out of sync on timing, so the Public Service Board was behind really where we were. They hadn't actually developed, excuse me, the Public Service Board in Carmarthenshire by then. They hadn't developed that, and so we were ahead, isn't it, really on the game on that. So we were out of sync on timing, but we are now in sync on timing, and we are now sort of working collectively together.
And I guess one of the other questions is, often town and community councils are people who have been there for a while. There may be a particular demographic as well. What sort of things are you doing to reach out to make sure that voices of people who aren't normally heard are part of those community conversations? Because there is no single community, is there? Lots of different communities that live in a place. So that's something that I think is particularly appropriate at the moment as we think about who is part of this particular place and what kind of future do they want to see.
I think it's fair to say, along with the members, because each of the members works within their own wards, they bring their own intelligence, isn't it, into this also as well. And I work very closely with all of the members as well. Obviously, you can imagine some are more active than others. We've had difficulty through COVID, isn't it? As every town and community council, many have had to shield, many have been super active. My role is to work directly with the community groups. So I will pick up with the Equalities Network, the Serious Cigar group also as well that supports refugees in Llanelli. I do work directly with the soup kitchens. We've got 3 in Llanelli. I do work very closely with food banks, for instance. So I work with the Multicultural Network. I work with People Speak Up. I work with, and lots of these we've developed over the years. I work very closely with Llanelli Community Partnership. So, what I try to do is understand, isn't it, with all of those voices that are going on in the community, that we try and capture that as much as we can. And we demonstrate that in the project work that we've got. So I will listen often to what's going on. I've got some strategic work in that. I'll work with certain key organisations also as well. So I do a lot of work, for instance, with People Speak Up and Young People Speak Up also as well. And I'm the first to say that I can't capture every voice. I'm the first to say that I can only work with those that are prepared to work with me or alongside us. And I don't capture everybody. I can't. But where possibly, we will try and work within networks, support those networks to develop, nurture them, listen to what they're saying, and then quite often we'll turn that into some form of project work, which then displays itself in our community development strategies.
So can we talk a little bit about those practical changes? There's a comment in the chat from Helen Taylor, which is, we talked a lot about structures and processes so far. What about the concrete changes, both positive and negative, have you seen as a result of this new way of working in a very collaborative way? Because that can be quite heavy weather, can't it? That sort of change, that culture change going through. But Absolutely. It's also a way of working that for some people is just totally outside their own knowledge of how things are done. So what concrete changes in terms of places or communities or services has Understanding Welsh Places enabled in terms of the data and the evidence that you've been able to use? Maybe the lottery bid that you were talking about before, but there may be others.
Yeah, the lottery is a key one, because it's given them really local sort of like data. When it's been able for us to be able to produce the story behind the baseline on things, and we can show sort of like almost sort of like a little bit of a story. It's only one A4 sheet. It's nothing. It can be easily picked up. If you look at the Llanelli Community Partnership, for instance, the data that we use for Llanelli Community Partnership, they work in a very similar way to us. They work in a very strategic way to us also as well. They've produced their own sort of like plans for the work that they're doing. Tonight, for instance, I have a meeting with an open partnership board meeting tonight. We're going to be discussing what we can do for Christmas this year with the group, and what kind of support do they need, in relation to, from the town council's perspective, in supporting what they want to deliver over Christmas. So they've got a real eye on, we know, for instance, the soup kitchens have been hammered and are currently getting hammered in Llanelli. We've got, we haven't got high levels of people living on the streets or anything like that, but we have got 3 soup kitchens that do operate, and we have seen sort of like a higher increase on that going through COVID and obviously going into the winter. So the community partnership are looking to, and this is an example, community partner looking to support them. Llanelli, which is the business improvement district, as far as the town centre, are looking to support that. So my role will be to bridge that gap between Llanelli and the soup kitchens. How can we get that, and how do we bring the mayor into that also as well? And so that's sort of like a key example of a number of community organisations working in a way that they're trying to support the need in the community and then sort of like delivering against that need. So we will have, there are a number of projects that will be supporting the soup kitchens, the food banks, going through Christmas also as well now. There's some more simpler project ideas that are going on, but the change management has been that the organisations are very much linked and will work together more now.
So you've got a really good baseline in terms of that ability and willingness to do it.
Yeah.
I guess there's a distinction I want to draw between what are the sort of medium to longer term changes you might want to see in a place, and how do you build to that incrementally? And then what's the sort of reactive stuff to what's happening now? And obviously, that's COVID-19, which is right here in front of everybody's faces still. Yeah. There's a comment from Johan in the chat, which is about Llanelli town having the hidden gem of an indoor market, which obviously because of coronavirus, traders have seen a massive drop in football. Are you able to work with partners like Carmarthenshire Council to boost businesses in the town centre, or is that something that's specifically related to bid, or is your role a kind of you've described it as a sort of connective tissue, I suppose, between local community groups and things like the bid?
Yeah, take the town centre. So we're part of Llanelli, we're part of the Business Improvement District. I'm one of 8 people that support. We've formed a working group within the town centre, and I sit on that working group. So in on that, we do have the manager, for instance, as you've just spoken about the market. We've had the manager for the indoor market and the outdoor markets, a lad called Paul White. And actually, we've actually formed a task force group to look at supporting the town centre through Christmas. Got a number of things that have been agreed. For instance, I'll give you a quick example. The Eckley Centre in Llanelli, unfortunately, due to COVID, weren't able to provide any Christmas decorations in the Eckley Centre. Ourselves and the bid have actually come forward, and the Eckley Centre will have a Christmas tree that will be supported by ourselves and the Business Improvement District. £2,000 is the cost for that, but that's one of 8 initiatives for the town centre that we will be doing, alongside something called we've got the toy box appeal happening in the town centre. We've got an initiative called Elf on the Shelf, which will be supporting buying local, also as well, encouraging people to buy local. We've got a theme for Llanelli, which is for this Christmas, which is called, believe it or not, Love Llanelli this Christmas. But we've been working with the Business Improvement District. We have provided lots of disposable cups with all branding, etc. on it, encouraging people to buy locally. And we recognise that we can't have the reindeer parade this year. We normally financially support 5 very large initiatives in the town centre through the year. So the reindeer parade is one of them that we normally look at funding. So we can fund financially, and we also support boots on ground also as well. So we're very much instrumental in the town centre redevelopment.
Okay, great. We've got some other questions that have come through in the chat and the Q&A. Question from Julie Richards. How much input did you have to the Art of the Possible programme led by Sophie Howe's team at Future Generations office? And we've talked a little bit about the culture change already, but is there anything else, have you been able to use this as part of that broader programme of work? I take that to no then.
We bang on the drum all the time in Llanelli and Carmarthenshire about the Future Generations Act and Sophie Howe's team. I would very much like a closer working relationship
Okay, so there's an offer on the table there, I think. Thank you for that.
That's okay.
Question from Ed Humphreys. Public, private and voluntary sectors all have a part to play in community partnership. You've talked quite a lot about the public sector and communities. What about the private sector? What sort of engagement have you had with local businesses?
Okay.
And have you been able to use any of the data from UWP, from Understanding Welsh Places, to say, well, actually, did you know this about your place and the places that you serve? I mean, one of the things, for instance, we're quite interested in exploring, and this might be a major headache for Scott, but I'm sure he can manage it somehow. You know, we've been interested in thinking, could we somehow, for instance, think about what the average cost of a supermarket shop is in a place, and think about how much of that is going to supermarkets out of that local area, and big multinationals, and think about how much food could be supplied potentially by local businesses. So have you been able to engage with local businesses in a way that could contribute to both, you know, supply chains, potentially jobs? Are any of those conversations starting to happen?
Yes and no, if I'm honest with you. I think where we're at currently at the minute is doing sort of like the groundwork. We do support a lot of what goes on in the town centre. You know, we work very closely with the Trade of Commerce also as well, and we have a close relationship in that kind of way. I think I do a lot of work also with Tesco's and Asda's also as well, and Morrison's. But that's more on a practical sort of like way of how they can look at supporting maybe the food banks or, you know, the care homes or et cetera, et cetera. I'll provide that link for those three sort of like. Asda's is in the town centre, Morrison's and Tesco's actually outside of the town centre, but it is still within our geographical ward areas. So it's working in two different ways. It's how we work in the town centre and how we work then in Trostre, for instance, or Pemberton, which is still within our geographical boundary area. But we recognise, isn't it, the town centre works very, very differently to what happens out of town centre. But you know, we are building our relationship. We've now got a group within the town centre that we operate with. We are able to provide the businesses. We have been looking at some data sets recently, you know, to look at providing the businesses with actually data of what's going on. And we've been working with Lee Walters on that AM currently at the minute. So that's slow progress. I would hope, isn't it, in time that we'll build on that. But the relationships are certainly there to be built on. Okay,
thanks very much indeed, Delyth. I think it's a point, Ellen, for something for us to pick up on, and particularly around the Chambers of Commerce and how we have those, you know, share UWP with Chambers of Commerce in different places across the country. Great. So some issues, I think one thing that has come through obviously from that conversation, Delyth, is it takes time to build that way of working together, and that trust between different places, in people in different places, even in the same local authority area, because that really matters, and identity is very strong therefore, and the identity of that place is very strong. So there's something there. So it's really important that that leadership role is shared, but also that you fit into you know, democratic systems and structures as they exist, but also make sure that you're reaching out constantly, proactively, bringing in new voices, so that their experiences can also help shape what the future of that place is like. There's obviously issues around resources and how much, whether it's the cash or the precepts, or whether it's other kinds of resources, human, energy, all those sorts of things can be brought into play, but also what sort of time horizon you're looking at. Are you looking at responsive stuff now that make it a nice place to be, but aren't necessarily going to be the things that are game changers and attract people either to staying there long term or bringing people back and contributing to that community? So it sounds to me as though you've got the first step. You're on the first step on that. I think it's probably just to go off what you've just said there. We do have a long-term vision. You know, we're planning for work for 2022 currently at the minute. So, you know, we have development plans which are more long-term. We have development plans which are responsive now. What's going on in the next 3 months, particularly Christmas and the focus of Christmas. We are though looking at Llanelli as a place, as a branding place also as well. We're part of
a project currently at the minute. It's been funded by the lottery, and we're 2.5 years into that project, about looking at Llanelli, how Llanelli advertises itself, how it brands itself, in order to be able to attract people to come to Llanelli. So it's one of the streams that we are looking at also as well, and that's working with a far bigger team again. So I think it all comes back to, isn't it, several teams working, having to pick your battles and look at look at what the war is, so to speak, and then sort of build your work plan, isn't it? Certainly around those key issues. And like I say, we can't do it all, but what we have done is identified some key issues that we can work to, and bring other people with us also as well, and nurture those relationships.
And this isn't something that happens overnight.
No.
I think it'd be great to have you back in a couple of years' time and find out where you've got to. So Llanelli is now the centre of, I don't know, this fantastic new business or community or destination for whatever, and that you've been part of making that happen. So
Llanelli's just trying to work together with others in Carmarthenshire as well.
Well, that's a good place to start.
Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed, Delyth. I really appreciate that. Are there any questions coming through the chat room at all, or comments? Today's session was very much about what the data is, how you can use it. I hope that those of you who've got another gadget to play with, I've got my iPad just here, could have a look at your place, or somewhere that you feel an attachment to and know something about as well, to find out, does this ring true for you? And if you're coming back to join us on days 2 and 3, maybe have a bit of a play around. We're going to finish slightly early today because we didn't have the Blaenavon session, so maybe use some of the time now to have a look at the data and say, well, actually, I'm a bit surprised by that. Is that really the case? And come back with some questions. Or, oh, that's a pleasant surprise in terms of, I didn't know that was either how that place saw itself, or that it had such a richness in terms of the assets. Like Scott said at the beginning, we very firmly wanted to do it from an assets-based perspective. We didn't want any labelling of places that, so we view all the names and all the labels are very neutral. We wanted we didn't want to talk about post-industrial towns, for instance. We wanted it to be, this place has a future, and it's up to the people that live and work there to shape their future. And of course, it's worth knowing, and it's important to know the history and the culture of that place and what it's known for. I've talked in very general terms today because it's about what we're trying to achieve overall. Over the next couple of days, we'll be hearing from particular places in the country who've used them. So tomorrow's session, Wednesday the 11th, is going to be shaping the future of our towns and communities. And we'll be exploring particular issues faced by Welsh towns and communities and the opportunities we have to shape their future. We've got a panel from across Wales and a fantastic case study also from the Mid-Steeple Quarter in Dumfries that came to our attention through our partners, Carnegie. On Thursday, the 12th of November, it's going to be about telling the story of your place, because it's words and emotions that matter as much as the data too. So we're going to hear some case studies from Cardigan and Treorchy on how they've transformed their own high streets. And there's going to be 3 different workshops on offer as well. So you can register for the next couple of days before, up until 5 o'clock on the day before. I'm hoping that many of you will have already registered on the ones for tomorrow and Wednesday too. But if you think of somebody who you either know or work with, or a member of your local community who might like to find out more about that, do please encourage them to come along as well. The blessings of Zoom are that there's no travel times, obviously, and the reach is great. So do please have a look at those. We will be stopping. There's a note from Ed Humphreys just now in the chat. We will be stopping for the silence at 11 o'clock tomorrow, if that's of concern to. I'm sure that will be of concern to many people. Thank you very much indeed for everybody for joining the conversation today. I know that it's a starter, isn't it, in terms of what you can do with the website. You can download the data and use it as you want as well, and so do have a play around with that. And we'll be talking about things like place plans and town audits over the next couple of days. So how does the qualitative side of things match up with the quantitative side in terms of what the future of that place looks like? If you've got any other questions from today, please do get in touch with Ellen Jones, who's our Understanding Welsh Places project lead. And her email is ellen.jones@iwa.org.uk. And I think she's put it in the chat already. I'd really like to thank our two panellists today for giving us their time. Scott Orford from the Wizard team, hosted by Cardiff University, and Delyth Jones from Llanelli Town Council. If you want to receive early notifications of future IWA events and recordings of all our UWP festival events, as well as all our other events too, please do join us as a member at iwa.wales, about us, support us. We're really grateful for the support of all of our members, and we think it's particularly important that people get to play their part in supporting an open, politically independent organisation at a really crucial juncture for Wales. So what we want to do is enable people to take control over what the shape and the future of their place is like. Thank you very much indeed again for taking part, and hope to see you again tomorrow and Thursday. Diolch.